how the body has a very narrow tolerance about pH. You know, in the end, the pH of the body is always 7.4 plus or minus 0.05. So 7.35 to 7.45. And this, you know, I don't ask you to remember very many values. This is one you should know. You know, the normal pH of the body is 7.4 because it's just sort of a critical measure of health. So, for example, you know, one of the most common reasons that a patient ends up being put on a ventilator is because their pH is too low. You know, so it's the kind of thing that really does matter in terms of taking care of patients. All right, so we touched on this a little bit when we talked about the respiratory system, but the relationship between CO2 and pH is a critical one in the body. Thankfully, it's relatively simple, and that is as the PCO2, or the amount of CO2 in the blood, goes up, the pH goes down. So we can express this as the CO2 goes up, the pH goes down, and vice versa. So as the CO2 level goes down, the pH level goes up. So the classic way of looking at this is, you know, as kind of a seesaw. As one goes down, the other goes up. So why? Well, it all has to do with this equation that we looked at when we talked about how 70% of the carbon dioxide in the body is transported back to the lungs as bicarbonate, right? And this same equation explains this relationship between PCO2 and pH. So if we take the CO2 and we increase it, it forces the equation this way. So it sort of pushes, you know, an equilibrium reaction can go either direction. And the direction it's going depends on the concentrations of the chemicals involved. So like in this equation, if we increase the amount of CO2, we push this equation this way, which means that we're creating more and more hydrogen ions all the time, right? More hydrogen ions is a lower pH. So that relationship is, that's this one right here, pushes that in the other direction. Now we can also do the opposite. If we lower the CO2, then it pulls the equation this way. So as, you know, say we're breathing particularly fast because we're anxious about something. Well, the CO2 is being exhaled, and as that happens, these hydrogen ions are pulled into this equation to keep generating CO2, and by doing so, now we're decreasing the amount of hydrogen ions, so our pH is going up. So that's what we see here. And of all the chemical reactions in the body, this one is the one I want you to know the most, because it comes into play in so many places. And as we're going to see a couple more places here in a minute. But so far, we've looked at this in the respiratory system about how does the body move CO2. First, it makes bicarbonate, and then it shifts it back into CO2 at the lungs. So we talked about it as tissues in one way, lungs in the other. And we'll see that that same equation can be used in some tricky ways by the kidney as it manages pH balance. All right. But first, a little bit about buffers. Did you do a buffer lab in lab? Okay, good. That should make this infinitely easier to talk about. Okay. So essentially, a buffer system is an equilibrium reaction that involves what we call a weak acid and it's salt. A salt is just two ions put together. So here we've got H and Y, and it can break down into H plus and Y minus, right? So the whole point of having a buffer system is you can add hydrogen ions or you can take hydrogen ions away, and the pH of that solution doesn't change. Now, since we know that hydrogen ions are what give us pH in the first place, you know, how is that possible? Well, when you have these weak acids and they're around, they can hold on to hydrogen ions when there's too many of them, and they can let go of them when there's not enough. So if we look at our two examples here, if we take this system in equilibrium and we add hydrogen ion to it, what we get is we get a reaction in this direction. So a lot of those hydrogen ions that we're adding, instead of hanging out as H pluses, they get bound to Y minus, and it takes them away from the pH measure, right? Same is true if we remove hydrogen ions. Now we're going to push it in the other direction. The hydrogen ions that were removed will come off of that HY, and the hydrogen ion concentration will change. So the way I think of buffers in general is it's a place to put excess hydrogen ions on a temporary basis, because we're not just adding them to water or the pH would go down. Instead, we have these buffer systems that can hold on to those H pluses and keep them from changing the pH. Now, an important thing in physiology is this idea right here, which is this is not a permanent fix. We haven't removed the hydrogen ions. The cells of the body produce acid all the time. And while buffer systems can prevent the pH from changing, we still haven't gotten rid of the hydrogen ions that were made. So eventually, if we don't remove the acid from the body, the buffer systems get overwhelmed, and then we do start seeing changes in pH. And typically what happens is we go from no change to sudden change. In other words, you can add hydrogen ions, add and add and add, nothing happens. But then once that buffer system is full, once it's saturated, then you get very big changes very fast, because all those hydrogen ions are in the system. They've just been hidden from that pH measure. So the buffer systems, and we're going to talk about a couple of them, are important, but they're not as important as the kidney and the lung is in terms of actually getting rid of the hydrogen ions, those acids that the body makes. All right. So the three major protein or buffer systems in the body, two are found in the intracellular fluid, and two are found in the extracellular fluid. All right, so we'll start inside of cells. So inside of cells, we don't have a lot of bicarbonate around. Bicarbonate is mostly an extracellular ion, and by bicarbonate, that's HCO3. Its other name is bicarbonate. Instead, inside the cells of the body, we have phosphate instead. So you've all heard about phosphate because it's the P in ATP, right? Adenosine triphosphate. So phosphate is a phosphorus, and it has 4 oxygen molecules around it, and it carries a negative charge. So this is a giant ion compared to like bicarbonate, which is just a carbon and 2 oxygens. So phosphate is a big guy. And in our energy molecules, if that's adenosine, we take 3 of these phosphates and we string them together, right? And then when we use energy, we get ADP, so we get 2 of those, and a phosphate. So all that to say, this ion is around all the time. And because it carries a negative charge, it can hold on to a hydrogen ion if necessary, right? Because the H plus and the O minus sort of go together. So inside of cells and inside the urine, we have this phosphate buffer system that helps to stabilize the pH in those places. Okay. And then on the other end of things, the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system, which is this guy right here, this piece of it. That's the principal buffer system in the extracellular fluid. So that's your plasma, that's your interstitial fluid. Well, what about this one in the middle? Proteins, which are found all over the body. Certainly inside of cells, the protein concentration is very high. Outside of cells, it is also high, not as high as it is inside, but it's significant. And proteins have a number of different properties that allow them to buffer hydrogen ions as well. In other words, hold on to them when there are too many, let go of them when there aren't enough. So first we'll look at one of the protein buffer systems, and that's what we've talked about already, and that's the hemoglobin buffer system. So when we talked about carbon dioxide transport in the respiratory system, we looked at a diagram a little bit like this, only it had a lot more pieces to it. But we take CO2 and water, so CO2 from the cells, we combine them together, we get bicarbonate, and we get an H plus circled over there, right? Well, where does the H plus go? Hemoglobin has the capacity to carry excess hydrogen ion. So it is a buffer. You know, when we talked about it in the respiratory chapter, we just called it a carrier. But anything that can carry a hydrogen ion is a buffer. So we have the hemoglobin buffer system. And because there is so many hemoglobin molecules found in so many red blood cells, hemoglobin ends up playing a major role in the body as a buffer, being able to hold those hydrogen ions and keep them from affecting pH. All right, so that's one way that proteins can do that. Another way that a protein can buffer is based on what it's made of. You know, proteins are amino acids all strung together in one long chain that's then been twisted into a shape so that it can accomplish something. All right, well, hopefully from your past chemistry, you've heard this concept of an R group before. So amino acids have, there are a wide variety of them, but part of the molecule that makes an amino acid is the same across every different amino acid, right? And it has this form here. There's a nitrogen, 2 carbons, and then 2 oxygens on the end. And then the R group is the part that's different. So like adenosine, tryptophan, tyrosine, they all have different R groups. In other words, the molecule hanging off this spot is different between the different amino acids, right? So we have a couple of different places that we can stick a hydrogen ion if we needed to, right? So let's ignore the R group for now and just look at the backbone structure. So the N, 2 C's, and 2 O's. Well, this side of the molecule, because nitrogen likes to hold on to electrons more than hydrogen does, it ends up being positively charged here. So, or it has a slight negative charge rather, which means we can add a hydrogen ion there. So that's a buffered hydrogen, right? It's been taken out of solution. Another place we can put it is down here on this O minus. Anytime we have a negative, pluses are attracted to those anyway. So we can stick a hydrogen ion there. So that's 2 hydrogen ions for 1 amino acid. And then depending on the R group, many R groups can also hold on to 1 or more than 1 hydrogen ion. So for 1 amino acid, we have buffered 3 hydrogen ions. So that's, you know, a pretty impressive way to store hydrogen ions outside of solution. And then if you remember that for a protein is a string of 1,000 of these, right? Thousands of amino acids in a protein. So that's an enormous buffering potential. And that's exactly what happens. So proteins, because of their chemistry, are natural buffers. You know, they want to hold on to excess hydrogen ions when they're present. And they play a major role in stabilizing the pH, both inside and outside of cells. All right, so proteins and amino acids as buffers. All right. Those two, here, let's back up. Okay. So the phosphate system and the protein buffer system, they're critical, but they don't really change very much. You know, they're stable. And the body has them at its disposal. But the one that's sort of active and plays a role in our metabolism is our dear friend, this carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system, which is what we've got written on the board over there. So this is what that system looks like. You know, you learned that a buffer was a weak acid and a salt, right? Well, here the salt is H2CO3, and that breaks down into H plus HCO3 minus. Now, what makes this buffer system special is this carbonic acid doesn't stick around. Because there's an enzyme in the body called carbonic anhydrase, whenever you have a carbonic acid, it has a tendency to break into H2O and CO2. But ultimately, the buffer is this piece. It's just the end product doesn't stay stable, so it breaks down. All right, so what we have here, here's that buffer system, and here's the hydrogen ions we're going to add. So we've had a period of increased metabolic activity. That always generates excess hydrogen ions. So those get fed into this buffer system. The hydrogen ion combines with bicarbonate, and it makes carbonic acid. The carbonic acid breaks down, the CO2 is released from the lungs, and effectively, we have destroyed this hydrogen ion by making water out of it. Okay, so we turned an acid into water, because one of these H pluses here came from the H plus that we added. So this is a really good system for an organism that breathes in and out, because it means that as long as we're doing this, in other words, as long as we're exhaling CO2, we can keep consuming these hydrogen ions, and here's the critical bit, as long as we have enough bicarbonate. Okay? If we run out of bicarbonate, this system cannot get rid of acid at all. So the only way the lungs can participate in getting rid of acid is if there's bicarbonate around. So when the cells generate CO2, they make a little bicarbonate, right? The H2O and water makes some bicarbonate here. But we want to have more than that, because our production of acid is not just by the production of CO2. We also make H pluses in all kinds of other ways too. So in addition to the bicarbonate made in this direction in the tissues, the body has another system for generating bicarbonate, and that's up here. So sodium bicarbonate is produced, essentially it is anyway, it's produced by the kidney. And what it does is it makes sodium, well, that's always a good thing to have around, right? Because we have plenty of that anyway. So we can sort of ignore that. But this sodium bicarb, this bicarbonate also feeds into this system from a different direction. So we have the cells creating bicarbonate, we have the kidney creating bicarbonate, and both of those sources allow hydrogen ions to be removed, turned into water at the lungs. So as long as blood goes through the lungs every once in a while, this whole thing goes this way, we get rid of the CO2 and the hydrogen ion as well. The downside is we consume a bicarbonate. So, as we'll see in a minute, the kidney is always concerning itself with making sure there's enough bicarbonate around. Otherwise, this system stops working. All right. So we call that the bicarbonate reserve. We always have more bicarbonate than is made in that by adding water to CO2. And that's so we can get rid of other kinds of acids as well. All right. So the primary role of the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system is to do which of those things? So you might have to look back in your notes from Friday to look at what is an organic acid, what is a fixed acid. All right, there we go. So the best answer there is D. Limit pH changes, that's what a buffer does, caused by organic and fixed acids. Well, what does that mean? On Friday, we talked about there are three kinds of acids in the body. The fixed acids, the organic acids, and the volatile acids. So, and one way to think of this is a fixed acid is an other. It's something else that generates a hydrogen ion. An organic acid is usually temporary. And the only volatile acid that we really talk about is carbonic acid, which is in the middle of that equation over there. So the carbonic acid bicarbonate system uses this to buffer these two, right? So fixed, organic, and volatile. A chemical that minimizes changes in the pH of a body fluid by releasing or binding a hydrogen ion is called which of those things that we were just talking about? Overwhelming response for you. D, it's a buffer. So, and buffers play a major role. Without them, we'd be dead. So, they are worth knowing about. Okay. All right. So, despite our body's natural defense of pH, pH can become abnormal. Because it's good reference. So we have two possible states, right? We have acidosis and alkalosis. And acidosis is body pH less than 7.4, and alkalosis is greater than 7.4. Alkali as in, or alkalosis as an alkali, acidosis as an acid. All right. So what is, what is the body's response to that, or how does it handle that? Okay. So here we have the addition of hydrogen ions. To get acidotic, you either have to have extra hydrogen ions being made, or you have to be not getting rid of them as fast as you usually do. All right, so we can represent both of those by saying we're adding H pluses. Okay, so in our equation there, we're adding to the circled H plus, right? So what happens? Well, the addition of that hydrogen ion is going to push this equation this way as long as there's enough bicarbonate. Okay, so as long as there's HCO3s around, this system will get pushed this way. And what we'll do is, as we see over in the corner, the respiratory response to a decreasing pH is to increase respiratory rate and depth. So as the pH falls, for any reason, the lungs breathe faster if they can, right? So if you're acidotic, you're going to be breathing faster and deeper, so that you can take those hydrogen ions and make them into water by separating the CO2 out of that mix, right? All the while that is happening, the buffer systems are holding on to that extra H+, and the kidneys are secreting H+ as well. So as they secrete hydrogen ions, the kidneys create bicarbonate, which then feeds back into this system and allows this to continue. So the response to acidosis is an increased respiratory rate, an increase in hydrogen ion secretion by the kidney, which creates an increase in bicarbonate production, which then helps to get rid of this in the first place. Now, that sounds like a great system. This will stop working because the kidneys cannot keep up with a high acid load. So let's say you are a diabetic and you have been taking your insulin and your glucose levels are through the roof, you're hugely dehydrated. At some point, this system will break down because the kidney can't secrete hydrogen ion fast enough. And if it can't do that fast enough, it can't create bicarbonate fast enough. And no bicarbonate means no way to get rid of hydrogen ions by breathing, right? So there is a limit to this, but in acidosis, that's what we see. We see buffers, secretion, creation of bicarbonate, and then an increased respiratory rate. So this is important because this part right here is, I think, because it means that anytime the pH is low, the respiratory rate will be high, even if there isn't anything wrong with the lungs. So the classic example of this is diabetic ketoacidosis. And in that condition, patients are breathing like they're in respiratory distress. They're breathing very fast, they're breathing very deep, they're huffing and puffing, even though there isn't anything wrong with their lungs. And the reason that they're doing that is because what is wrong with them is creating so much acid that their pulmonary system is in overdrive, basically. So one of the classic presentations of that kind of diabetic crisis is a patient who's breathing fast and deep. We call those Kussmaul respirations. All right, anyway, little sidetrack. Okay, so if the kidney is the rate-limiting step, which it is, what of all these pieces, what's going to break down first? And it's going to be this. The kidneys can only secrete acid so fast. So let's zoom in and look at what is happening in the kidney in response to acidosis. All right, so we take CO2, some of it's from the blood, some of it's from the cell itself, and some of it's from the tubular fluid, but all those sources get added together. We do our little trick. We take CO2 and water, a little carbonic anhydrase, we get carbonic acid, and then boom, we get a breakdown. And here's where the kidney is, does some pretty fancy chemistry or pretty fancy molecular physics. So the bicarbonate breaks down into an H plus and an HCO3. And you'll notice that the products of that are sent in two different directions. So if we look at this, H plus and HCO3, we said that as long as there's bicarbonate, we can use bicarbonate to get rid of H pluses in the lungs, right, by pushing this way. So the perfect thing we would do is we would keep the bicarbonate and get rid of the hydrogen ion. And that's exactly what the kidney cell does in an acidosis. The bicarbonate goes out into the blood because it can now be used to get rid of a hydrogen ion in the lungs. And then the other piece of carbonic acid, the H+, gets pumped into the tubular fluid. So we have what is essentially like a perfect response because it's a double effect. We get a bicarbonate in, created, and we get a hydrogen ion out, gotten rid of. This bicarbonate can then go on and get rid of another hydrogen ion in the lungs, right? So it's a very smart system that the kidney has here. So bicarbonate goes one way, hydrogen ions go another. And your new textbook doesn't talk very much about buffers in the urine, but just like there are buffers in the blood, there are buffers in the urine too. So all of these H pluses that are getting pushed out here, they then get held onto by buffers that are present now in the urine so that they go all the way out. So that phosphate buffer that we talked about is one of those that happens out here. So the H pluses get pushed into the tubular fluid by a variety of mechanisms there. All right. So what about alkalosis? What happens in the reverse? Well, how do you get that? You either have removed a bunch of hydrogen ions, which technically you could do. If you took a whole bunch of Tums, let's say, Tums grabs hold of hydrogen ions, and you cause yourself this condition. The more common cause of this is that you're removing hydrogen ions faster than you need to. But in any case, so if we remove the hydrogen ions, what happens to our equation? Well, here, if we pull these down, it has a tendency to pull this whole equation this way to sort of make up for it. So it will have less respiration as pH goes up, respiratory drive goes down. So we'll have less respiration, which means an increase in CO2 in the blood because we're not getting rid of it as fast. And essentially we'll have movement in this direction. So the hydrogen ions are being removed somehow. So this equation goes this way. At the kidney, we see, instead of hydrogen ion secretion, we see bicarbonate secretion. So the kidney can switch what it does. If there is too many hydrogen ions around, it excretes those. If there's too much bicarbonate around, which is what this would cause, an elevated bicarbonate level, then the kidney gets rid of that as well. Now, it's important to note that alkalosis doesn't happen very often. the body very much has a tendency to make acids, not bases. So when you get a scenario like this, you have to be careful because you could be wrong. Because alkalosis is so uncommon that you have to really look at the history to see if the labs you're looking at are possible for this patient. But there are some examples. There are certain kinds of medications which will put you in alkalosis, like too much antacid. Early in a vomiting illness, patient vomits up the hydrochloric acid that they've made, and that can cause an alkalosis from removing those hydrogen ions. But this is a much less common thing. All right, so there again, if the kidney is where the magic happens, well, what is happening there? Well, when the pH is too high, that same pattern that we saw is flipped. So we take CO2 and water, we make carbonic acid, it breaks down, but now we're going to pump the hydrogen ions back into the blood, and we're going to pump the bicarbonate into the urine where it can be gotten rid of. So the kidney is, the lungs, because the lungs work how can I put this? The lungs can get rid of a lot of acid in a short amount of time, but the kidneys can do it with careful control. So even though the kidneys can't get rid of all the acid that the body makes, because they can do stuff like this, flip, where the hydrogen ion and bicarbonate are going, it helps to keep us an acid-base balance, right? So in response to alkalosis, is bicarbonate is secreted and hydrogen ion is reabsorbed. Both of those are going to work to elevate or to reduce the pH back to where they should be. Because we're adding a hydrogen ion, right? So that is going to decrease pH directly. And then by getting rid of a bicarbonate, we've pushed our equation towards the right. So to elevate that hydrogen ion concentration there too. Okay. All right. So no talk of acid-base balance is complete without talking about acidosis and alkalosis and the two types of each. So essentially there are two ways you can get into acid-base trouble. I mean, this is a simplified version, but there are two broad categories. One is respiratory. There's something wrong with your lungs, or there's something wrong with your breathing. The other is not respiratory. And we call that not respiratory category the metabolic. Okay, so we have, in the case of respiratory acidosis, this is pH is too low because the respiratory system isn't working right. So, for example, a patient who is not breathing, they have overdosed on some opiate, and they're breathing very shallowly, and they're breathing very slowly. Well, the lungs will not be removing CO2 fast enough, and that equation will start to back up towards the right, and their pH will go down and down and down. So we call that a respiratory acidosis. The reason they're acidotic, the reason their pH is too low, is because the respiratory system is not getting rid of CO2 fast enough. So classic example there is, a drug overdose. Another example would be a lung disease, like COPD or pneumonia. Anything that is a barrier to CO2 release is going to cause an acidosis, respiratory acidosis, yes?
So when someone overdoses on Benadryl, you go through where it looks like The Exorcist, where the muscles are just tensed out. Is that,
right. That has nothing to do with that. Okay. No. That's and I can't put my mind on the word, but it is not, that doesn't cause respiratory depression. Okay. It just looks bizarre.
Yeah.
It's hard eye dyskinesia is what that's called. But yeah, it's not just Benadryl. Any medication that works like Benadryl does will do the same thing. All right, respiratory acidosis. Well, what if you're acidotic and you're breathing just fine? Can that happen? Sure it can. And we call that a metabolic acidosis. So this is, diabetic ketoacidosis, for example. The overproduction of certain acids. So let's say you have been doing heavy anaerobic training without any breaks in between. You can end up with metabolic acidosis from the lactic acid that you're producing. So A metabolic acidosis is a decrease in pH, but the lungs are not the problem. It's some other there's some other problem creating that increase in acid production. These metabolic acidosis are a bear to diagnose. So it always requires a big, long differential diagnosis where we consider all different possible reasons for it. So this is the most complicated one. We're not going to talk about it. All right, and then we have the alkaloses. So a respiratory alkalosis is an alkalosis, so pH is too high, because of the respiratory system. In this case, you're breathing too fast. You're breathing too much. So you are getting rid of CO2 faster than you need. In our equation over there, it's being pulled to the left. So your hydrogen ion concentration is going down. So the classic example of respiratory alkalosis is anxiety, hyperventilation, as people would call it. So one of the reasons why, what's the classic, how do you fix hyperventilation? You have somebody breathe in a paper bag, right? That is actually true. That works. Because as you breathe into the paper bag, the CO2 you're exhaling, you're re-inhaling. So it helps to stabilize your pH until you get over, whatever it is you're upset about. Because the classic hyperventilation thing is people start doing it and it makes them feel funny. So now they're even more anxious because now they think there's something wrong with them. So they breathe faster and faster, and they'll eventually go unconscious and they'll survive. But the paper bag thing really doesn't work. All right. And then metabolic alkalosis is the rarest of all four of these because this is an alkalosis caused by something other than the respiratory system. So you're talking about removing acids of some kind or maybe addition of alkaline molecules like, a Tums overdose. So the metabolic ones are the tricky ones, and they're beyond our scope. You'll talk about them in pathophysiology, about metabolic acidosis and alkalosis. But for today, we're just going to look at the respiratory variety. All right. So in a respiratory acidosis, the problem is the lungs are not keeping up with the creation of CO2 by the cells. So in respiratory acidosis, our equation starts to back up. If CO2 is not being removed and is continuing to be added because we make CO2 all the time, eventually there gets to be more and more hydrogen ion because the lungs are not getting rid of it by combining hydrogen and bicarbonate. So in a respiratory acidosis, we get pushed this way, and eventually the buffer systems are saturated, and we actually start to see a hydrogen ion concentration going up and up and up. So, what is the solution to a respiratory acidosis? Somehow, some way, you have to get the CO2 out. So, this is, like I said, principal reason why people are put on a ventilator is because they're not, it's called hypercapnia. They have too much CO2 in their blood, and for whatever reason, they can't get rid of it fast enough. So the kidneys will try to compensate. They'll try to get rid of the excess hydrogen ion, but they just can't keep up. The most of the volume of acid elimination in the body is done by the lungs. Larger organs with a more effective way to do it. So if respiratory acidosis happens slowly over time, then the kidneys can adapt and can help to compensate. So in the COPD patient, for example, who it's not like their lungs suddenly got bad, like somebody in an overdose. They've been getting bad over time. Well, those patients will compensate by having kidneys that produce very acidic urine to get rid of that excess hydrogen ion. But eventually, it gets too bad and the kidney can't, and it collapses. All right. So what do we see there? All right, so here's homeostasis. We have disturbance. So hypoventilation, the pH goes down, the PCO2 goes up. The compensation, first respiratory compensation is attempted. So the brainstem signals the lungs to breathe faster and deeper. If that doesn't work, then the kidneys start to compensate. They secrete hydrogen ions, they make bicarbonate, And then all the while the buffer systems are trying to stabilize the pH, or at least keep it stable. If everything goes as planned, the PCO2 goes down, the H plus goes down, the bicarbonate goes up, and then we get back to homeostasis. So respiratory acidosis is all about CO2. If you fix the CO2 problem, you fix the whole problem. All right. And then respiratory alkalosis. This is where we have the opposite problem. Too much CO2 is being breathed out. It pulls this whole equation this way. Your hydrogen ion concentration starts to fall. So normally this is due, psychogenic. That's from the mind. So anxiety. There are some drugs that in overdose can cause an alkalosis as well. All right. So what does that look like? We have a decrease in CO2 and an increase in plasma pH, right? The first response is respiratory. So the brainstem turns the lungs down. It's you breathe less deep and less often. If that doesn't fix it, then the kidneys start to compensate. So hydrogen ions are secreted into the blood, bicarbonate into the urine, so it flips its usual routine. And then the buffer systems help to stabilize the pH in the meantime. Ideally, all those things will result in an increase in CO2 in the blood, an increase in hydrogen ion, decrease in bicarbonate, and now you're back to normal. All right, so a couple of questions, and then we'll call it a day. All right, which of the following descriptions best fits the acid-base disorder metabolic alkalosis? Oh, yeah. Jump in there, last couple of people. All right, so the best answer there is C, consequence of prolonged vomiting. All right, so metabolic alkalosis. Metabolic, when you hear that, think not respiratory, okay? And alkalosis is pH is too high, you have too little hydrogen ions around. That's the very rare one that we talked about. So how did you get there? Well, if you vomited a lot of your hydrochloric acid in your stomach out, you would become alkalotic, and your lungs would have had nothing to do with that. So it would be a metabolic alkalosis. But these other answers are worth going over because they represent some of the others. So tissue hypoxia in ischemia. So this is a restriction in blood flow to an area of the body. No blood flow means huge amounts of acid produced, right? So if we have ischemia, not enough blood flow, that isn't a lung problem. It's probably a heart problem. It's a cardiovascular problem. So that would be an example of a metabolic acidosis, where the decrease in pH is due to some other thing besides breathing, right? And then B would be a great example for respiratory alkalosis, and D would be respiratory acidosis. All right. Okay. Good. Which of the following descriptions, Beth, this is not the same question, it just looks like it, fits the acid-base disorder respiratory acidosis? we have an even tie between B, C, and D. The best answer there, respiratory acidosis, would be C. Reduced alveolar ventilation, like you get in emphysema. I know you haven't learned about emphysema yet, but if you imagine if there's less air getting into and out of the alveoli, there's going to be less CO2 exhalation, and that's going to cause that equation to back up to the right. The pH is going to fall as the CO2 goes out.
All right.
Huh?
No,
No, we picked A because we just had that one. All right, that is all for today.